Hello and welcome to a Blood Red podcast special with me, your host Joe Rimmer, joined today by two special guests to talk about a man that many of our listeners will remember. Some of our new listeners might not know him, but Dan Kay was a long-time Echo journalist, a regular on the Blood Red podcast. Dan passed away a couple of years ago and is someone that we still hold very close to our hearts. I'm joined by Dan's cousin, Amos Waldman. How are you, Amos?
Yeah, good, thank you, and thanks for having me.
No problem at all. And Sam Carroll also was on the Blood Red podcast a few times.
Hosted.
And obviously a former friend and colleague of Dan. We've got plenty to talk about. Dan is brought out, we brought out a new book, LFC Stories, pulling together some of the best work from Dan. His knowledge about Liverpool was unrivaled, and he would write really detailed and fascinating long reads on some of the heroes and the villains too. Mario Balotelli, I believe, is in there from Liverpool's history. It's going to be a really fascinating read. I was lucky enough to edit some of those stories. I think you probably will have done too, Sam.
Yeah,
that's right. And it's coming out in association with the Dan Kay Foundation, which was set up in Dan's name. So we've got plenty to talk about. But I wanted to start by asking you both, just to give. A lot of our listeners will know Dan. They'll have known his love and passion for Liverpool, and we've talked about him a lot on the podcast. But tell us a bit about Dan, the man. You obviously will have grown up with him. Tell us what he was like.
He was just so kind, generous. Always thought of him as being really smiley, bubbly. He was just the sort of person that you'd look forward to. I always look forward to seeing, because he was brought up effectively by my grandparents. His own parents had issues and he helped with them, but I saw him regularly at family events. We'd have for Jewish festivals, and then for Christmas Day we always got together with my gran cookie an amazing meal. And then later on, when I worked in Liverpool, I'd meet up with him and see him, and he'd always sort of show me the good places to eat. He liked his food as well. But he was just passionate about everything that he did. His encyclopedic knowledge that people talk about Liverpool, it wasn't just about Liverpool, it was about pretty much everything. And he was always just so generous, so modest about his achievements, and he always listened to any issues that he had. I mean, he was just, I think other people have said as well, but he always made you feel like you were the most important person in the room. And he just gave so much to other people all the time. Just incredibly generous with his time, and wanted to help, help people more vulnerable, and really, support causes. So many, huge variety of causes around the city.
Well, when you said that, he always made you feel like the most important person in the room. When I joined the Echo 11 years ago, on my first day, they sat me next to Dan. And obviously really nervous on your first day in any new job, but especially at the Echo, where I'd had ambitions to work, sat next to Dan, and it was just like a godsend, because Dan made me feel so comfortable. He was obviously a big Red, so immediately started talking about Liverpool. Then found out that I lived on Penny Lane, Dan lived not far down the road, so we would get the train in together, and he made my start to life at the Echo. He made it so easy. He made it a joy, coming into work and sitting next to Dan. I know you will have similar memories. Obviously, Dan would then move across to the sports desk later in his career, but Dan was somebody who you were very close to as well when you were at the Echo.
Yeah, I think, as both of you have said, it was the sense that there was just always that kind of natural inquisitiveness to him. It didn't matter whether, like you said, Joe, you were on your first day here at the Echo, whether you'd been here 25 years, whether you were work experience. He treated everyone with that same kind of just human compassion and respect and an interest to get to know people. And I think that is what always stood out to me. And obviously, when Dan made that move across from a news journalist to a sport journalist, and I know a lot of people listening will know all about his achievements in relation to the Hillsborough inquest, and helping our city achieve the justice that all those family deserved, and what a vital role he played in that. But I think one of the big things that stood out to me when he moved across to sport, Joe, and you'll probably remember this yourself, is I was a young lad in my early 20s, and hadn't worked at the Echo for too long, but he would still ask questions and want to learn things from you as well. Absolutely. And this was a man who had achieved, more than any of us could ever probably hope to achieve in journalism. And that's not putting any disrespect on ourselves. The things he'd done for this city, are quite incredible to reflect on. And that is just something that always stood out. And, you know, as Amos said, always had a smile on his face. And, you know, we loved those Thursday night Echo games of football when he'd turn up in his little orange beanie. Whether it was November or June, the orange beanie would be on, and he loved kind of scoring. Oh, he'd love scoring a few goals and bringing them back up to you weeks later and letting me know what ones are conceded.
Yeah, he would love to talk you through one of his goals, wouldn't he? Like he'd scored it at the Cop End. I shifted it from my right foot onto my left foot. Gave the goalkeeper. Yeah, he'd always do that. Can we reflect a little bit on Dan's? As you said, a lot of our listeners and our readers will know Dan's history working with the Hillsborough Justice Campaign. But can you reflect on that a little bit? Because Dan, he never really publicised it. He never really shouted about his own role in that. But he was so important, wasn't he? And the families know how important he was.
Yeah, he was. I mean, supported the families. I mean, he wrote about them, and he more than wrote about them, didn't he? He became friends with them. He became their rock of support, really, for so many families. And I think, you could see from his writing how much really it meant to him. And I think from later on, I'm sure, from the book, the articles that are written in there, he spoke about Hillsborough, and it was in many of the articles that he wrote. But it really did impact him, I think, in the end, and especially when he was talking about the injustices that arose, whether it was Duckinfield or the earlier Hillsborough, inquests. It really affected him, I think, and his mental health, because he took it all on board.
Mm-hmm. And Sam, when he moved across the sport, and some of the stories in this book, I'll talk about one of my favourite ones, and I remember editing it at the time. But what are some of the ones? I mean, you will have edited some of these, I guess, at the time. And what are some of the ones that stick in your memory?
I think obviously going back through them for this collection, I think one of the things that stood out to me and really made me smile, because I felt like it was just so Dan, was, as you mentioned, Joe, this book has got everyone from, say, Kenny Dalglish to Steven Gerrard to Mario Balotelli and Andy Carroll. And one of the things that I realised, kind of reconnecting with Dan's writing, that he kind of, there would be the temptation, I think, certainly in more modern journalism, to kind of write about your Balotellis and your Andy Carrolls in almost like a kind of sneering way, and how it didn't work out and how they weren't good enough to play for Liverpool. But a real sense that I got from all 20 stories of whether, they were more lighter tales, like, Steve Finnan going missing after winning the Champions League final, or they were more serious stories, about players who potentially battled their own illnesses, like Marcus Babbel. All of them, including your Balotellis, including your Carrolls, there's such a kind of compassion and care, and it's written like a true Liverpudlian, and that was the thing that really came across to me. It was just good journalism, and and all of the stories, even for me as an Evertonian, they are genuinely, I'm not just saying this because it was Dan, but they are so interesting to read. And I'm sure, as you're about to say, Joe, you always got that sense when he worked here. And I was saying it the other day, there was sometimes when Dan would send you a story and you'd roll your eyes because it would be quite a long tale and you had loads to get through, but there was never once when you'd get to the end and you'd be pushing the button and you'd be sending the story out to the world for, in some cases, millions of readers to read, and you didn't know that someone would find out something new, find out something interesting, or just be reading, something that was crafted with such care and precision. And, that is obviously one of the major things I think people like me and you, Joe, who worked with Dan, will always miss about him.
It was that care that I think really stands out in his writing, and I remember editing particularly is read about John Aldridge, and taking through Aldo's career, obviously getting to Liverpool, playing for Liverpool, Hillsborough, and then eventually leaving Liverpool. And it always sticks in my memory that Aldo, who's one of our columnists, tweeted that afterwards and basically said, "This is one of the best things I've ever written about myself." And Dan did that without sitting down and speaking to John, but taking the care to go through everything and doing all the background reading, bringing some of his own memories into it. And you get that through them. I think we started with some of the longer reads that Dan was doing during the pandemic. I think I remember having a conversation with him about, I think, the Craig Johnston one he did.
Yeah.
And it was incredibly long in terms of what we're used to sort of journalist filing, but it was so rich and so detailed, and it immediately found an audience. It was like people, and maybe during COVID especially, with a bit of time on their hands, really connected with them immediately. And then that was kind of Dan's thing. Then it would be every day, what other story can you tell? And he told so many and so well. And you must remember this about Dan, because this is something that sticks in my mind, and speaking to anyone who knew him, that he had this memory of Liverpool events that you would say to, he'd say to me, I remember the first time I went to a court, ran a court story in the Echo, because that was the day Liverpool drew 0-0 with Middlesbrough, and someone hit the crossbar, and you'd be like, how can you remember that? Do you remember that?
And the goals, the times they were scored, the scores of every game. It was, it's remarkable, this memory.
And how does it make you feel seeing this book? You've just said before we've come on, this is the first time you've seen it.
It's really emotional. I mean, it was emotional the first time I think Sam sent a picture of what it would look like, and it really hit home. Is to have a permanent memorial of his, of his work, and it is his finest work. And I know a lot of thought went into this. But I mean, I don't have the book, but I've listened to Sam sent the stories that we're going to go into it on a PDF, and so I listened to it on a Adobe Acrobat Pro, which was in some ways was the opposite of Dan, because it was a strange voice reading in an American sort of accent, devoid of any sort of personality or sympathy, which is completely opposite of Dan. But the thought that went in there, and you can really see Dan for through his writing, as you say, the amount of topics that he covered, whether it was, like you say, Craig, with the Predator shoes and everything, and then with, like you say, the sympathy with Balotelli and his background and the explanations of why he was the way he was, and then through to hope and heartbreak at the end when they're, even talking about COVID in that, and saying about Klopp's speech when COVID had happened, and taking it a minute to think about the wider issues and the impacts of global events and stuff. It was just amazing what he could fit in and make it, and it was all relevant, but emotive as well. It means a lot to Dan's friends, to Dan's family, to have this permanent record of his finest work. Yeah,
and just going back to what you were saying earlier, Sam, about it was his ability to bring out the humans behind these footballers. As you said, that we, as football supporters, we have a habit of treating them a bit like commodities, and Dan was able to go a lot further. And Andy Carroll is another one that sticks out to me as somebody who was a young man, and Dan captures that.
Yeah, and I think that it boils down to who he was as a person, and that is what is always incredible to me about Dan. Especially in this kind of modern era of football fans being so tribal and so partisan. Especially in the city that we're from, and the teams that we covered. It really is incredible that he never lost that sense of, he was the true football fan. He was the person that you'd want to be sat next to going to an away day, or he'd be the person that you'd want to be having a pint with, talking about the footy, because, he was always so, balanced and so caring about both teams. Obviously for long-time listeners, they'll know that his nickname amongst most people is Purple Dan. The mixture of red and blue. he was so respectful about both clubs, and even the times when I'd sit there and try my best to wind him up about it, he would be happy. He would genuinely be happy when Everton won, and he would genuinely be happy when Liverpool won, and he always had that respect for both clubs, and I find that quite incredible too. And also that sense that as you two are sitting there talking, I've realised that I know for a lot of listeners, being a sports journalist covering Liverpool Football Club is the dream job, and I know that everyone here at the Echo feels that sense of responsibility sometimes. But Dan, across that long career and so many achievements, you'll know this, Joe, and I know that you've given him that role during lockdown of writing those long reads. I know how much that meant to Dan personally, but he never lost that love of journalism, and he never lost that sense of appreciation that he was going out and being paid to write about Liverpool Football Club and his heroes.
He was the perfect, as you say there with the Purple Dan, he was the perfect representation of what I think a Merseyside football fan should be. Yeah. He loved Liverpool. He appreciated Everton and supported them until Derby Day. And then he also supported Tranmere as well, because he would often go to Tranmere when he wasn't at Liverpool games. And he appreciated what every club meant to support it in this city, and I think again in this age of tribalism, Dan stood apart from that. But you wear the Purple Heart there. We all wear the Purple Heart on with this badge. Tell us a little bit more about the Dan Kay Foundation, and some proceeds from this book will go towards it. But what that means and why that was set up.
Well, again, it's sort of bringing together. I mean, it all started off really following the first charity football game that Sam and Echo colleagues put together, which was fantastic. A few of us were talking and it ended up agreeing to do the Liverpool half marathon. And then it's sort of one after the other. There were various other fundraising events, weren't there, through it? And it got to a point sort of towards the end of last year where we were thinking we need to do something and make this, a permanent record, a permanent memorial and foundation, really. And from there, we sort of got together various people who were from different walks of Dan's life, who we'd all, I suppose, some knew others more than other people did, but we sort of got together all these different groups of people, and they're all really important, either trustees or an army of volunteers that we have that we get together and organise these fundraising events, as I say, through a variety of individual and group fundraising efforts. And we look at obviously continuing Dan's legacy, which was a huge thing, towards supporting causes that Dan would have supported. Sort of trying to look at it from Dan's point of view, but also obviously, given its relevance, championing men's mental health generally, and suicide prevention, which is obviously an area that needs a lot more investment and attention. And also, finally, probably, I think spreading kindness, was a phrase, or as we prefer to call it, being a bit more Dan. Encouraging, and again, people have done that through across the cities, across the footballing divides. Dan has, he's not here to see it, which is unfortunate, but he has brought people together, and that's a really important point, because we're all together, united in our admiration of Dan, and all like to we're all people that Dan cared about as well. So it means a lot that we're here carrying on his legacy. And certainly there's a lot to do, and it's taking a lot of us to do that, isn't it?
Yeah.
Realise quite how much Dan did, but it's important, and it's it's a responsibility, but it's something that we enjoy doing.
Yeah. And what does it mean for you, Sam? Obviously working with the foundation.
I think it's just seeing all the incredible things that have happened, and the incredible people we've met, and as Amos says, it's tragic that has happened in the way that it has, and we would swap a lot of it, all of it, to have Dan back. But Amos, one of the most inspirational, kind of hard-working people I've been lucky enough to meet through that. Leanne, who represented Dan in his inquest earlier in the year, an inspirational woman, and even people, Maria Breslin, the Echo editor, all the way down to people who put shirts into the raffle for the football matches and things like that. And Amos talking about there, it's transcended football teams, it's transcended countries. We done Dan was a keen runner. We done a 5K initiative for fan support and food banks. It spread as far as Liverpool supporters clubs in Indonesia, raising almost £3,000 for food banks. And I just think some of the things that stick out in my head, I think Christmas Eve, after Dan had first passed away in 2023, I got a call from An Hour for Others, which is obviously quite a big charity in the city, and the guy from An Hour for Others was like, we've got a problem. Dan used to come in every Christmas Eve and take food hampers, and he would deliver them to low income postcode areas across the city on Christmas Eve.
He never told anyone.
No, we didn't know that was a responsibility.
Yeah, I mean, Christmas Eve he told us that he delivered and made it out that it was one day he would do these deliveries. But he was doing it for days, weeks, I think, in lockdown.
Yeah. And that them saying that, it was incredible. And I think, as Amos has just made the point there, it makes me laugh sometimes that there's 10, 15, 20 people sometimes getting involved in these things to do the work that Dan would do alone. And as Amos said, he would either not mention it, or he was massively downplaying the things he was actually doing, and other incredible things. He's probably too modest to mention it, but after Dan passed away, the London Marathon got in touch after learning about Dan and his achievements, and offered Amos a place in the marathon. And
typical Dan, though, that he had that.
It was typical Dan. But was it 7-8 weeks training? You done a 3-hour 27 marathon?
Yeah, I think my knees have suffered since, but it's worth doing.
And that combined with the Liverpool half marathon, as Amos mentioned, that raised £7,000. And I think we've spoke about it, haven't we, Amos? I think the thing that's always blown me away is we went into the first charity football match aiming to raise £300. We raised over 5,000. You know, we went into Amos's marathon and Liverpool half marathon again. You know, the football match done quite well. We probably won't be able to match it because it was a one-off thing after Dan had, you know, only a few months after Dan had passed away, we raised £7,000. You know, we've had a businessman, you know, almost come in unannounced. You know, he chose to stay anonymous. You know, but one of the kindest things we've probably experienced as a charity, walk into a meeting and donate £5,000 and tell this, you know, incredibly emotional story about when he was suffering with an addiction. You know, it was Dan was one of the first people he spoke to who helped him kind of work through that and become the businessman he is today. And, you know, all those things is, you know, things that we're so, you know, utterly proud of to be a part of. And as Amos says, you know, we are a charity that we don't at the moment have any overheads at all. You know, we're on about £30,000 raised, and every single penny either has been reinvested in projects across the city in the northwest or will be. And that is the responsibility that by wearing these purple badges, Joe, as you say, you know, we're not only owing it to Dan, but to ourselves, to the people he worked with, to the people he loved, and that's a really, really inspirational thing, I think, to be part of.
Yeah, and Amos, what are the future goals for the foundation then?
I think obviously to carry on raising the money, but we do want to affect positive change in mental health, and we've got one of the relationships we've built with again Liverpool Hope University. We did an event there, and they awarded him a posthumous doctorate, which I was fortunate enough to collect on his behalf. And we've developed a good relationship with them to the extent that they recently had 6 of their students on a placement with us carrying out work. And one of the strands that we're going to do is research towards looking at the findings, because we learned sadly through Dan's inquest that a lot of mistakes were made, and a lot of those mistakes are repeated. And we want to look to where we can, you know, look at the problems, make sure that they're addressed, and try and get better, as well as raising the profile and reducing the stigma of mental health. Also trying to affect positive change so that people don't go through what Dan did and what, you know, we did as a family, and that sadly lots of people do. So we're going to work together with Liverpool Hope. They've also got they're advertising for summer placements, so they're going to continue the placements they had were relatively short, but they're going to carry on that work, looking at things like prevention of future death reports, where previous inquests have looked at what the failings are, again, to try and identify what the real problem areas are with a view to addressing them.
Okay, and Sam, you talked before about some of the support you've had. Sir Kenny Dalglish, Dan's biggest hero, biggest legend in Liverpool history, has written a foreword for the book, and the club have given you that support, haven't they? What does that mean for you to see that in the book?
Yeah, to be honest, it was one of those moments where, you know, to see that email come through from the club, obviously not from Sir Kenny himself. He wasn't just emailing me on a random night, but, you know, the forward that he's written, which the club sent over, you know, there's a paragraph in it, and, you know, anyone who worked with Dan, anyone who knew Dan, knew how much Dan revered Kenny and was his favourite player. And I think, you know, one of the nice things we were able to do, Amos, after Dan passed away, was give Dan's family his Liverpool Echo shirt with the number 7 on. You know, he had a big affection to Kenny, and, you know, there's a paragraph in the forwards which you know says that in Kenny's eyes, Dan Kay is a hero to so many, and, you know, to read that at the time and to recount it now is incredibly emotional, and these are the stories that keep coming out, and, you know, the support that Liverpool as a football club have given us. You know, Jurgen Klopp, you know, personally holding a minute's silence after Dan's death, that will live long in the memory. You know, the kindness of Jurgen Klopp to do that, and obviously then when Anfield stood to applause in the next match against Aston Villa at Anfield, you know, another moment that just really signified that Dan Kay is a hero. You know, is a hero to all of us in this room, and is a hero to a lot of people in the city, if not everyone in the city, who's aware of what he'd achieved. So yeah, we you know, we thank Liverpool and Kenny Dalglish for doing that, but, you know, we also understand that, you know, Kenny is right. The Dan is a hero, and as Amos says, this is now a permanent tribute to Dan, and I know that there's going to be Liverpool fans across the world reading that and get a true sense of who Dan was.
Yeah. Just quickly, there are so many of these articles, so many of them. I was going back through his author page and looking at them the other month, and how did you choose them? Because there's so many brilliant ones to choose from.
I think it's hard because, when we speak on this as well, I always like to make the point to people when we talk about Dan is that, there is a tendency after people pass away to, memorialise them in this kind of perfect way. But when we talk about Dan, everything we say on this, it's so hard to explain, but it's all true. It's we're not embellishing anything, we're not adding anything to it. And I think Dan was probably one of the journalists in the newsroom, Joe, and I think you'll definitely agree with this, is that so many of his stories that he filed were weirdly memorable, weren't they? We dealt with hundreds of stories a week. We dealt with breaking news. We dealt with massive events like Champions League finals and league title celebrations. But there were so many that, as you said, remember how good that Craig Johnston piece was, the Marcus Babbel piece really stuck with me, when it went into, the personal problems he had and then hitting into his illness, Remember the Andy Carroll story, the Steven Gerrard, and then finishing with the piece when Liverpool won the league, which, as Amos said, was just the perfect. I think it was the piece of the time, that we were in the middle of COVID. It had been a really tough time for Liverpool fans who weren't able to celebrate properly together, but also had, lifted the Premier League title for the first time in, I think, 30 years. And, so many pieces, Joe, and I know you'll be the same. It was like reading them 5 minutes apart from the first time when we'd sat in this office and put them in the paper or put them online. So to reconnect with Dan's work like that, and for Amos and the family and the other trustees to allow me that privilege, is something that will stick with me forever, I think.
And Amos, there's a launch event at the Liver Building on Thursday night for the book, and I believe it's already up to number 3. You were saying before in the Amazon charts,
incredible,
which is incredible, isn't it? Father's Day coming up. It's just the perfect thing to buy a Liverpool fan, and I know I'm not just saying that, it really is.
Yeah, it is, but I'd go wider than that. I don't think it's just Liverpool fans. I think it's got such wide and broad reach. I mean, reading that as a non-Liverpool fan, it brings back a lot of memories. I mean, some players, Balotelli, for example, I almost forgot that he played for Liverpool because you associate him with Man City and, Sterling to an extent as well. But these, historically, they're just such a good read, and that element of humanity that's in there that isn't in every article that you read, it just makes it very different, I think, and it's a very readable compilation of Dan's finest work.
The book, go on, sorry, you want to say something?
No, I was just going to say, I think it's already been a privilege for me it came out last Thursday, so it's not even been out yet a week. It's up to 3rd in the charts, but also just to have people reaching out to me in work, through friends, family, things like that, to message me and say, we've just ordered the book, and things like that, and to be spreading, Dan's stories, hopefully around the globe like that is a massive thing. And, with proceeds going towards the foundation as well for anyone listening, it will generally go towards changing the lives of people across, the Northwest, and which Dan was passionate about.
We'll make sure about it. And, it's it'd be remiss of me not to thank you for all the hard work and the idea in the first place, so thank you.
Well, LFC Stories is the book, is available on the Reach Sports shop for £11.24, or you can buy it on Amazon, any other book retailer, Waterstones. Anything else you'd like to say about the book whilst we're on it?
Buy it.
Buy it. Get it bought. And thank you very much. Be more Dan. I think it's
definitely
an incredible phrase. It sort of sums him up perfectly, and I think it's the right way to live. So, Amos, thank you. Sam, thank you. Really appreciate it. And thank you very much.